without further ado, why don't we pass the mic over to Stefan? It's going to be an introduction from him on subnet 1, and then we're going to take some questions about that presentation, plus just anything inside the ecosystem that people want to talk about. Yeah, and we have Bond Connery up on the stage, new head of communication at Opentensor. Big round of applause to him on his new position. We're very happy to have him. A Tau holder and a Tau Chen member and a Discord member and a long-term Bittensor fanatic for for years now. So it's fantastic to have him coming through and helping us communicate better. Thanks for being here, Bond.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Did the people in the Discord hear that? They all heard that. It's amazing. Okay, it really does go both ways. Okay, then let's do it. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, can you see me?
We can see both slides right now.
Oh, you're on my other screen. Oh, let me maybe if I just do something really clever and technical. Boom. Did that work?
That worked.
It's looking
now
like
you can just see my title slide. Yeah.
Correct.
All right. Awesome. Yeah. So thank you for the intro. Today I want to talk a little bit about kind of what has happened in Bittensor since the Revolution release a mere 115 days ago, guys. What has been built, what has been destroyed, and the glory in it all. And then I'm going to follow up that with a perhaps much less grandiose, but I still hope compelling story about what Subnet 1 is now becoming. So we'll jump straight into it. So the retrospective, well, sort of starting at the beginning of this journey that we're kind of all on together, the dream of Bittensor has always been to decentralize intelligence. What this means is we're all empowered to build things so that they're not behind a gatekeeper, so that we can all bring our brilliance, our weirdness to this project and express our different ideas and build something collectively that is much greater than a single centralized technological solution could ever provide. And walking along this timeline, the next step, the next major milestone, the release of Finney, which occurred actually less than a year ago. It's kind of hard to believe. That was actually before my time at Opentensor, but it certainly feels like it was a lifetime ago. So this was actually just mid to late March last year when Finney came into it became the new blockchain that we were working within, and what it brought with it were a lot of really important structural changes, and that enabled the first modern
Later in the morning. Sadly.
I got it. Don't worry about it, Stefan.
Thanks. Yeah. So very shortly after Finney was released, in fact, 24 days later, the Foundation released the first subnet, which was subnet 1. And of course, this subnet was under the control of the Foundation. This was very much a research vehicle for us to understand what is this strange beast that we've created. And so we played with it for a while and we looked at it from a few different angles and we tried a bunch of stuff out. But then we had a really great idea, which is, what if we give it to you? So we decided that there came a time, and this time was, of course, the Revolution release, where we wanted to see what everyone else would build with this technology. And this was, of course, a pivotal moment, and it's the main thing that I'm going to be reflecting on in this presentation, was the actual decentralization process that enabled anyone to build their own subnet. And this was the Revolution branch, and this happened at the beginning of October last year. And we allowed competition to take place, and it was fierce, and on occasion we had to depart our gaze away from what was unfolding. But nonetheless, beautiful things grew out of it. A Cambrian explosion of ideas, a Darwinian process. And what continued in 115 days is 50 subnets were created. More than 31,000 different miners have participated in subnets in less than 4 months, which is absolutely staggering. And what is the net result of this? Well, it's raised the bar for all of us, ourselves included. And confessedly, Subnet 1 needed it. So where we stand right now, barely a moment since the release of Revolution, was that we're all now co-owners of Bittensor. We're all building on top of this protocol. This is now something fully collectively owned. So I want to talk a little bit, paint by numbers, and just show you guys what I think are some pretty cool plots that kind of show the evolution of the beginning state of our project to where it is today. And I'm going to show basically a couple plots that analyze the distribution of emissions and how they became decentralized. So I'm not sure how cleanly it renders on my screen right here, but what you can basically see in the left plot is the ownership, or basically the amount of all of the tau that was emitted that went into different subnets as a function of time every single day since Revolution was released. And what you see, of course, at the beginning is subnet 1 had all the pi. But very quickly, brilliant ideas took flight, and it was undeniable that they deserved to be a big stakeholder in this ecosystem. So what you see very rapidly, less than a month after Revolution, there were already many subnets that were already bringing value. And fast forwarding to today, this distribution has only become more uniform and more of a meritocracy, let's say. And I think that's also illustrated by the plot on the right, which is sort of the spread of emission. So it's like, in some sense, it's the measure of disparity between subnet emissions. Compared to where it began and where it's going, you can see that this is only getting lower and lower. And we don't want this to be completely flat. We want the best and brightest people that hire the best talent from other industries to come here. And, you know, this is capitalism. They should come here and they should take what they earn. But at the same time, it's really great to see that there's no individual strongmen that are holding the door anymore. And again, this plot, the second set of plots that I show you here is sort of a different lens where you can sort of see what emission looked like at the beginning, where it was over 80% going towards subnet 1, subnet 11 was basically taking the rest, and subnet 0, which was effectively people abstaining from using their voting power. That very quickly has settled into something where the average emission is now something closer to 3 or 4%, which is actually pretty close to 1 over n if you think about it. And I imagine that as we fast forward a couple more months, this is only going to get closer and closer. So that the best and brightest subnets, they can realistically only expect to do, you know, a hair's width above the median or the average if we have a hyper competitive space, and that's maybe where we're going to be heading. It really depends on a lot of things, and it depends on what people are building. But I personally think that's great. It's pro competition, it's pro improvement. So I want to spend a moment as well and just take a look at the landscape kind of that we can behold now that we've built, and it's big. So these are the subnets that are present today. There's 32, of course, but there's been more. There's been 50 in total. And they are spanning a very broad space of possible utility, from scraping the web at scale, healthcare, advertisements, multimodal and artificial intelligence. I will be hard pressed to squeeze everyone into this list, but I'm deeply impressed by what people are building, and I see the standards are improving every single day. I do want to highlight a few of what I would call the top of the food chain right now, just because of their incredible work. But Cortex, of course, is a word on everyone's tongue. Mog really sees the initiative, and he built something fantastic, which is not only a very functional and high utility subnet, but he built a front end for it as well. And he was really one of the first to ever cross the finish line on that. So we're all, in many ways, we're all grateful that we have people with that kind of drive and that kind of capacity that can drive us all forward. So Cortex, of course, is text-based, but it's also multimodal. And like I mentioned, it also comes with a full developer UI experience, including API tokens if you want to access it. I'm sure Mark can speak plenty to the myriad of other things that his subnet can do, but I just wanted to tip the hat towards that. Secondly, of course, Taoshi and his time series prediction subnet. Right now, it's based on Bitcoin, but we know he can go in many different directions with this as soon as he says it's the moment. And he's been nothing but successful in his pursuit so far. So it's been really, really cool to see what his team can build. And actually, lastly, the last one I'm going to showcase on this particular presentation is FileTau, which is actually some of our homegrown talent at the foundation. This is Philanthrope and Rusty that built a decentralized storage subnet, and reading the source code, I'm like, oh my God, these guys are freaking geniuses. It's really, really rigorous, really mathematical dense, provable. It's brilliant. And they're also enjoying the benefits of that now. And, you know, this isn't to say that, oh, these guys are all such rock stars that no one else can reach maybe those levels. I don't believe that's true. And even if there are people that are just clearly absolute killers in this game, successful subnets benefit the whole project. All of us stand to gain from demonstrations that our technology can do great things. So with that said, I also now want to just take a sip of water and then talk about what we've been doing since Revolution. So while you guys have been busy building subnets, we've been trying to make that process as smooth as possible. And of course, when we release something like this and people are stress testing it from so many different interesting perspectives, we quickly see where we can improve the developer experience as well. So I just want to give a nod to a few members of the Opentensor Foundation. For example, Watchmaker has been making absolutely amazing documentation that I think I speak for everyone when I say, like, I use it every day. Super, super helpful. Secondly, of course, the Bittensor core repo has also been improved and polished in many ways. BTCLE has much more functionality than it did just a few months ago, and everyone is getting more and more comfortable and more sophisticated and proficient with the use of Bittensor, and we have been wanting to facilitate that for the whole time. Another important springboard for people to develop in this project is, of course, using the subnet template so they can kickstart their own projects as quickly and painlessly as possible. So again, Philanthrope has been one of the leads on that. And it's only getting better and better, and expect the trend to continue. And lastly, sort of a whole cluster of front-end user interface type apps that we've been building as well, led by our front-end team, Mihao, Elo, with the Bittensor wallet, which I think is absolutely gorgeous, the mobile app, which is soon to be released, and of course the Bittensor website. So just give those guys a moment to show off their work on the slides here as well. And you can see the docs are updating very regularly. And I also, I love this website. I think what this also shows is how our efforts to release Revolution, and also the efforts of all of the subnet creators, this plot alone basically shows how the level is rising for all of us in the best possible way. More people are coming to this project, more people are building with it, and that, again, benefits all of us. So with all of that said, I'm going to say a few things now about where the Foundation and Synapse Labs, who are the team that developed Subnet 1, and soon other subnets too, where we want to take Subnet 1. So as I alluded to earlier in this presentation, the bar got raised, and we obviously needed to up our game too. You guys found so many awesome ways to do things that we had to really step up. So I'm going to start with the why. Why do we have to redesign Subnet 1? Perhaps many of you are screaming at your computers right now because it's perhaps very obvious to you, but for the benefit of everyone, what we learned was Subnet 1 was simply not aligned. And what this meant was the incentive mechanism that it contained was not sufficient to ensure that miners would remain useful and do useful work. And perhaps a few of the main points for why this was the case is, well, we were perhaps optimistically relying on quite subjective ways of measuring miner performance. And it turns out in a completely trustless, decentralized, anonymous environment like ours, that's a really big leap of faith to place. And so it was, you know, in retrospect, I wouldn't call it a mistake, but it was certainly a learning opportunity for us that we should make our incentive mechanisms as explicit as possible about what is desired from the behalf of the miners. And secondarily, I would say this kind of dovetails with downstream application building. The validation process was not really orienting miners in their fine-tuning efforts towards being maximally useful in user interfaces, in user applications. And this is because we were using, you know, very structured approaches to the conversational template. And as a result of that, it was just quite easy for miners to become highly successful at dealing with predictable prompts, but very quickly either useless or even just refusing to respond to actual real human queries, which is of course not the desired effect. So yeah, that's kind of the why. Now, the what do we want to do with it? We want to make subnet 1 the entry point into Bittensor that can ultimately leverage the intelligence produced by other subnets. It's a natural fit. It's the first subnet we've been building for a long time. We've been learning, we've been taking notes from you guys, and we're ready now to get back into the arena. And what we want to do as an entry point is we want to bridge different subnets so that the digital utility that they create can be accessed and routed efficiently. And of course, there's a lot of technical nuts and bolts that need to be ironed out before we get there, but we believe that our first steps towards this position is quite powerfully. So what is that position? What is that design? Well, principally, it's the idea that we want the miners to be adept at using tools, but using tools in circumstances that are not necessarily obvious. We don't want to just say, use this tool to do this. That's maybe interesting, but it's not really an end-to-end idea. The better way of doing it is saying in fuzzy, human, sort of ambiguous language, hey, I'm stuck on this. How do I get to that? And then the clever agents that the network produce recognize from the ambiguity of the language, this is the underlying query that the human wants to be served. And now we can go and fulfill that request. And whether that request is something we can do on subnet, meaning we can utilize Wikipedia, other tools and APIs, that's one thing to do. And there's certainly a whole set of problems and use cases that can be mostly fulfilled by just competent language models embellished with basic tools like web scraping. They can also reach out into the data sets produced by other subnets. So whether it's live Twitter data or 1,000 other things that I couldn't possibly enumerate right now on the spot. This is another example of how miners can really become much more functionally useful. And lastly, of course, just accessing other digital commodity, whether it's sending a request to a user to analyze a data set, which is analyzed in another subnet, and then the data is stored in another subnet in this fully decentralized, autonomous way. I think that would really be the dream for subnet 1. And just to spend a moment talking about the reward landscape, this necessarily needs to be something that's adaptable and open-ended. So we're not going to have this really clear-cut, obvious reward mechanism anymore, but something that's actually, in some sense, the mountain has no summit. You just want this virtuous cycle of competition and survival of the fittest to just on-go and on-go until you basically have really polished, high-performing miners on the network. And that's where we want to go. And the last thing I'll say on this is this requires that we think very carefully about the general case of incentive mechanisms so that we don't just have a single simple incentive mechanism, but we think about what are the general rules incentive mechanisms. And this is something we've been thinking very carefully about and something that we're slowly deploying into the product. So now for the how. How do we get there on subnet 1? How do we get to where we're at right now? Well, the key idea was we know that we want the miners to deal with ambiguous human language and then be smart enough to recognize what we actually want. So we sort of formalized that and we turned it into a design. And the design here is basically that the human agents, as we call them, which is the role play that the validators take on, they're constantly asking the miners to do stuff for them. They're having this ongoing novel conversation. Within that conversation, they're not being very specific. They're being kind of lazy. They're actually kind of moody. And that's because we make them moody. We use personas so that the validators take on personality. And what we also do is we rely on what we call tasks. And we have a suite of tasks right now that are present in subnet 1, but we're going to continue to increase this list and also adapt this list so it's more consistent with other subnets. And each task is sufficient to drive the behavior of an agent towards some goal, which is why now when miners are talking to the validator, they're really getting told what to do. And if they don't do it the right way, the validator has opinions. This is kind of what we're thinking. This is what we want, because we want the validators to be just like people using the network. And one of the key factors that makes this possible, and I would say is kind of the buffer between what we have right now and something like what we had before, which was riddled with exploits and very difficult to keep on track, was we want to make it really hard for miners to understand what the underlying request really is. And the way that we do that is using this persona and this role play effect. We basically paraphrase what the query is with lots of other maybe fluffy language or fuzziness, such that there is a real kernel of a question in anything the validator says, but it's not easy to extract it. You need some baseline amount of smartness, some amount of intelligence to actually figure out what is required of you. So it's quite hard to reconstruct what the query is based on the prompt that the validator sends to the network, whereas going from the query to the prompt is quite easy and straightforward. So we kind of call this like a one-way function, kind of like a hash. And the last thing I'll say, which we decided to build into this new version of Subnet 1, is we've decided to lean heavily into explicitness and objectivity when it comes to rewarding miners. So not relying on the judgment of a small language model to determine if a certain text completion is of high quality or not. It turned out that, I'm not going to say that's just doomed to fail, but I will say that it's hard to do given a constrained budget of resources in hardware that you're probably going to be working with. And of course, this certainly is a consideration when you're building a subnet. So yeah, there have been some really ingenious solutions as well. Ours is by no means the only one that has with, but we think that it's a contribution to the collective understanding of what we can build. So I'm actually not going to spend a moment on this flowchart because it's quite technical, but if the questions about specifics, we can come back to it. I also just want to be mindful of time. So I'm going to skip to the next and actually the penultimate slide, which is a tweet from a guy called Andre Karpathy, who is a world-class AI researcher, head of AI at Tesla, amongst a million other things. And he made an observation recently, which was in some ways the seed for what we decided to build with Subnet 1. He made the observation that language models are much more than just compressions of the whole internet and memorizing and doing some form of intelligent retrieval, but he sees them as sort of the kernel of this entirely new version of a computer, of an operating system. So you can basically just talk to it using human language. And like I said, in the description of Subnet 1, it kind of understands what you want from that and goes away and executes the appropriate instructions. And I think it's such an interesting paradigm to think of LLMs as this precursor to the new generation of computer. And it also makes me think about what does that make Bittensor as a whole. And what I came up with is if language models can basically be the operating system, then something as multimodal and something as expansive and effectively limitless as the Bittensor protocol is probably going to become something like a decentralized supercomputer, where it has the OS kernel, but it has all the hardware and the networking it needs to basically do anything it wants. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. There's a lot of really interesting ideas in this presentation that we could dive in with questions. Like one of the things that I think is really fascinating about the design of, and you didn't really touch too deeply into this because I think we have a fairly layman's audience, but the validation mechanism is very similar to revised an autoencoder machine learning model where you have all of the context on the validation side, you compress that, you send that out to the miners in this case, and the miners need to be able to to expand from the limited information by scraping the web or seeking into embedding databases and using Bittensor in general to reconstruct the query and solve the problem. I think that's really interesting because if we were taking classical machine learning ideas and injecting them into the incentivized arena, and is my assessment correct there? Or can you speak to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really great summary of it.
Excuse me, guys. I'm quite sick today. This idea of the subnet becoming the entry point for Bittensor. Can you expand on that idea as well? Like, what can you imagine these miners do across the operating system of Bittensor? What are you going to force them to do through this validation process?
Right. I guess I'll answer that in two stages. The one stage sort of motivates why we need an entry point, and just to make it really clear, we're probably not done at 32 subnets. We're far from done. So at which point we're going to have so many subnets, it's going to be hard to index them and understand what they all do and sort of what Bittensor as a collective brain can bring. And so I think that is what necessitates the need for an entry point, sort of an abstraction away from all of the subnets and what they do, something that understands what can be done and then just routes requests to them as required. As to how we're going to do it, well, I think there's a lot of technical detail that needs to be fully fleshed out. And the academic in me is always reluctant to say things that I can't back up completely technically. But what I believe to be true is that as we develop the bridging protocol so that we can have validators communicate to other validators and validator miner interactions as well, what we have is we have an adaptable framework in subnet 1 where miners must demonstrate that they can effectively use this ever-changing list of tools. And these tools can be anything from, like I said, web-scale datasets, APIs, but also a subnet can be thought of as a tool. If I have some way of telling a miner, hey, go and point at subnet 13, ask somebody there because they're all really good at this thing. That's the way that I would integrate sort of all of the different subnets, or at least the subnets that are accessible via subnet 1. I would integrate them all as additional tools that are available to miners, and so that they're aware that I can go and do this if I reach out to this subnet. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yes. So why don't we open the floor to some more people, so it's not just me asking questions about, because I'm the mega nerd here, obviously. We also have Bond on the stage. Maybe Bond, you want to unmute yourself? Keith, you're welcome to pipe in as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna try from the Twitter side.
Can you guys hear on the Discord side?
Okay.
Yep.
Hear me. So essentially my question to you, Stefan, is how will this new change bring more users to the Bittensor network? How do you see it becoming easier for them to access this information?
I couldn't hear you perfectly. It was a little muffled, but just to reflect back what I heard there, you were asking how this will make more people be able to use Bittensor. Is that effectively what you asked?
Yes, that's what he asked.
Right. Well, I think one is, I mean, again, when we have a really large pool of dynamical changing subnets, we need to start thinking about that's a pretty hard thing to come in cold into. People that are just joining this project are like, okay, so what's a subnet? What does a subnet do? Oh, it does one of 361 different things. Go and check tau stats, or go and check your preferred entry point. I think that's just inherently quite disorienting for people that want to come into the project, especially if they want to build on top of subnets. It's going to be quite hard for them to know who to partner with, who to strike up a conversation with. And what we want to make is something that's much easier for people that are coming in to understand what is available, what is sort of on the Bittensor menu, so to speak. So I hope that through that effort, we can make it an easier on-ramp for new people into the project, just so that they can have easier visibility on accessing that intelligence without needing to necessarily dive into the weeds straight away.
Awesome. Mog actually has a question. My question first, great work to you, Stefan. It's so satisfying to see S1 rising to its full potential as it should be. However, do you see it an immediate use case in the short term on the path to what you were envisaging, or is it more focused on developing towards the long-term goals before it really becomes something we can all use?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are already starting to design what front ends we can use with subnet 1, but admittedly, we are a team of researchers, and we old habits die hard. So we love polishing the brains behind the subnet, and kind of never feels finished. But we recognize this time that a huge part of the value that any subnet brings is its ability to interface to the outside world. Mog, as you've shown us, you've really led the way on that. So this time around, we're not going to just sit in the background and have a cool research toy, but we're also going to start building a UI. soon.
Beautiful. I believe that was a French question. Can anyone interpret that? No, I'm just kidding. Likely someone unmuted. But Stefan, how are you envisaging the miners facilitating the cross boundary here? Like, have you written these miners so that they use other subnets currently?
Right now, I'd say the abstraction layer that we're at this point, considering it's still pretty early for us, is we've recognized that subnets can be viewed as tools that an agent can use. So we're really trying to design this in the most general and flexible way possible. Looking towards bridging between subnets, like I said, I hate to put my foot in my mouth and overcommit to a certain approach. So we'll have to save that the specifics of that question for a conversation in the near future.
Yeah, this one is sort of like a collaborative effort between a number of the main subnets. There's work going on between 22 and 18 around how miners will access the other subnets, and it looks like something that will be built in. Philanthrop is working on this right now as like a interconnect ability for miners to different subnets. So if you're on subnet 1, you can get data indexed on 4, scraped on 14. I believe that's the right number. And also synthesize data from 18, except synthesize from GPT on 18. I think that's what's in the works right now, but maybe that's a bit off topic for this presentation. This network, though, will begin to force the issue on that interconnect because it's what is being directly incentivized by the validators.
Yes. But I do see that there's multiple stages of deploying this. I mean, you can talk about things like the databases that are created by subnets as the lowest hanging fruit. If you can get access to web scale data sets that are novel and created by subnets, that's the first and possibly easiest way to benefit from other subnets. And then you can think about, well, should I send requests to validators or to miners? If you send them to validators, it's nice because they can validate the response. They can give you some indication as to the quality of that intelligence before it's sent back to you. And if you go directly to the miners, of course, you end up with the age-old problem of ensuring that everything's aligned. Perhaps you could do sort of your own miner to your own miner, and then you take the reputational hit if your miner on another subnet would turned out to be untrustworthy or otherwise useless. I think there's so many ways to cut this, and like I think they all have a lot of different merits, and they're all going to bring, going through validators has the issue of load balancing, of course, which people are already starting to think carefully about for their applications. Going directly to miners means you tap directly into the raw pool of intelligence, but you run the risk because there's no gatekeeper to make sure that what you're taking out of that subnet is necessarily high quality. So I think it requires, like I said before, it requires really careful thought and maybe it's adaptive based on the needs of that particular bridging operation.
Great. Okay, well, if there's Bittensor credit score, if there's no more specific questions about this presentation, Stefan, you're going to be releasing the slides, perhaps with a link. We'll attach it to the end of the Twitter thread so people can take a look at that. Barry will send it to you directly. And then now we'll just open the floor for people to ask general questions about this, if they still have any, or about the ecosystem in general. If people have any questions there from the Discord, we'll do the Discord first, and then we'll move to the Twitter Spaces. Bond, I'll let you help me on the Twitter Spaces side, if you can, please.
Do.
Is there an expected release date for the wallet app? Well, it is. Oh, sorry, you mean the iOS app? We're not releasing that date yet, but it's going to be Q1. So in the next couple of months. People are wondering about the DTAO bit 2 proposal. So currently, the Bit2 proposal is in the works. We've taken a lot of the feedback from many different individuals from the community at large, and we're putting that together into a research paper so that we can alleviate a lot of people's fears about the original proposal and make it explainable and more, digestible by the layman. There's no direct date for that. We decided to take a step back from working on dynamic tau. We thought it was slightly premature. People felt that it was premature, so we've taken a step back in the next couple, next month at least, while we focus on more machine learning research and expanding the subnets.
All right. From the Twitter side, we have Wombo. You can unmute yourself.
Check, 1, 2. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
We can hear you, Wombo.
Cool. Thank you guys so much for the presentation. I got just thinking about the sort of the future of this, where you've got subnet 1 playing the role of the guide, the menu, the index that helps someone new coming in figure out where to go to and what the sort of offerings of the different subnets are. I wonder, would it be useful or valuable for the subnets themselves to have like an LLM on their side that can talk to subnet 1 and say, here's what I can do, here's some of the new data sets I have, and maybe somewhat connected to that, how important do you think it is to bring any of this intelligence and AI decision making on chain? Sorry if that's an incoherent question.
No, it's a great question. There's a lot of different ways to answer it. So with bringing it on chain, from the very beginning, our goal was to bring all of the validation off the chain. And that turned out to be a very good decision because it allowed us to be incredibly versatile in the way in which we validated things. It brought up a whole bunch of issues, of course, because there's not as much consensus security and validation potential when things are not totally committed to the chain. But for instance, in some cases, things that we want to validate are just simply impossible to validate on chain. Like if you want to put a large language model that has 1 trillion parameters and you want to make updates to that, it just wouldn't have been possible on a standard blockchain. So that's why we use the abstraction of weights and human consensus in the first place. But I think the first part of your question was about how do the subnets advertise themselves to subnet 1? And you said maybe a language model could play that role. Can you elucidate a little bit more on what you mean there?
Yeah, so let's say I'm subnet 203 and my subnet does meme generation.
Yeah.
And so, someone comes into subnet 1, they want to make some memes. Subnet 1 needs to figure out that, subnet 203 is the right place to go to.
Right.
And maybe part of the way that happens is like you send out this kind of question to all the subnets, like, hey, can you do meme generation well? And each of them has an LLM that responds, yes, actually I can, or no, actually I can't.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that's an interesting concept or not.
Well, you can imagine this type of thing eventually arising. But generally, if you look at the way in which miners behave, that they take the path of least resistance. So they do the thing that's the cheapest for them, the easiest for them to do. And that's just implied by the very nature of using incentives in the first place. We don't tell them what to do. We just reward them for doing things right. And so, one of the outcomes of that decision is that people don't always do what we want them to do. But whatever they do, it's going to be efficient, depending on how you measure it. So if it's like, hey, you're a miner, and as a miner on subnet 1, you have some bandwidth on the scraping subnet or the meme generation subnet is in your case, and we say, hey, we'd like you to generate a meme because that's this complex task that we've built into the validation process on subnet 1, and they go use a different meme generation technology. Maybe that's because that meme generation technology is better than the subnet 132 that you suggested. And we can't really know that beforehand if that will happen. We can only really build the incentives to get what we want and also build the technologies to facilitate that interaction. So first things first would be ensuring that there's a usable protocol for miners to interact across subnets. And then we will build the incentives that say, hey, you need to generate memes from this question on subnet 1. And then miners will perhaps use that protocol to connect into that subnet. If they don't, we have to revisit the protocol or the incentives. That tends to be the way these things adapt. And now subnet 1 is just, it is the first subnet, and there's high ideals, and it's likely to be successful because it's an amazing team. But if the way that the validation process, the incentive mechanism is designed does not actually get the miners to perform properly and talk to other subnets, somebody else can come along and do it better. And that was what Stefan was speaking about at the beginning of the presentation. He was showcasing how really competition has always been the saving grace for everything in Bittensor. If we can't do it, somebody can come along and do it better and force miners to properly use their resources that they have access to inside the Bittensor ecosystem. So hopefully that's a suitable answer to you, Wombo.
Yeah, thanks so much.
No problem. Now, there's a couple of questions here in the Discord. There's one I think which is directly for me, which is about the pseudo key. That I have now given up the pseudo key to Voon. So a couple people might know who that is. And I will no longer be on the triumvirate. I'm no longer a subnet owner, and I am no longer a delegate. So I am just a civilian who is working on this project full time, 100% of my life. But I think that's the way that it should be. I really want to be pushing up from the bottom and ensuring that no matter where people are coming into this ecosystem, that I'm at the same level as them and can contribute just as much as me. So we thought Voon was the right choice. He's been here forever. He's a computer scientist. He's a genius. He works with the foundation. He's been working for us for a long time. A lot of people love him in the community, and I think he's on mission with us. There was many other people that I considered amazing potentials for the community, but we decided that Voon was the right pick, and yeah. So there you go. Lots of fire emojis in the Discord on that one.
Great job, Voon. I actually have a question for you, since we're seeing a few questions about dynamic tau. Without getting into the details of the proposal, can you talk about the process of the ongoing proposal and what that's going to look like?
Well, we wanted to get something out to the community as quickly as possible that was specific and academic, and told people about the overall vision and the problem that we were solving so that we could get feedback. And we got an incredible amount of feedback, and we then took that feedback, and we've been doing research in the background. We have an actual implementation on a branch of Subtensor for the original mechanism, and we're evaluating it there. We've done a large number of numerical evaluations and statistical assessments, and we're also going to be getting economists involved. There's also a large number of people here in the community that have opinions and that we're in communication with that are participating in that process. We want to get to some people have full consensus on via a bit proposal structure, where we had bit 1, we got feedback, We're going to put a bit 2. It will come with, additional, documentation, eventually even an implementation so people can play around with it. And then finally, maybe before bit 3, we'll have it on the chain. So I can't give a very specific date to when this will happen because it really depends on the greater ecosystem of people on this call, on the Twitter spaces, those that are not here, that really get to decide when this thing comes out and people are happy with it.
Awesome. Also seeing another question, which I think we can clarify, which is more about the validators, the intelligence, the data that they're using, and whether the models will be outperforming those validators. So if Stefan can be coming back on and explain a little bit how this can scale into the future, or from you.
Yeah, I get the question. It's of course, it's a really consequential decision. If you're using a language model to produce a reference answer, then you're effectively capping the intelligence of any given miner. Their optimal strategy is just to mimic whatever the validator is doing. I'd make 2 points to that. I mean, first of all, the validators that are creating those references are actually creating those references with the benefit of a rich context, in some cases, like an entire Wikipedia article, or the benefit of some otherwise really useful context. So one thing there is that reference answer is not really a 7B model parameter answer. It's presumably considerably better, and from the ones that I've reviewed, they look great. And of course, the upside here is we can scale up. I mean, the open source large language model community is moving so fast. I think we're probably a little ways away from Llama 3 coming out. And so I'm actually not concerned about what we can do with a reasonable GPU budget anymore. I think with 14 billion parameters, we're going to be in great shape to have really fantastic quality model performances. So the idea of the reference answer limiting the intelligence of the miners, I think perhaps it's a short-term thing that you could argue, but I'm really not worried about it big picture. It's nothing for us to switch a 7 billion parameter model like Zephyr that we're using right now for Mixtral, or something that's already GPT level. And with a little bit of quantization, you can still fit that on an A100. It becomes an economic question at some point. But the second point I want to make to that is this is actually only necessary for language-based tasks anyway. Programming-based tasks, mathematics-based tasks, anything strategic or planning, we've actually been thinking carefully about ways to, we're not beholden to the limited capacity of someone generating the reference. Sometimes the reference answer what the miners are graded on is just ripped straight out of a textbook or something similar, meaning it's as high quality as a high quality data set could possibly be. So it's definitely a thought, but I'm not concerned about it. It's something we can easily grow with.
Thanks, Stefan. That was a nice technical question for you. I really think that the research that you guys have done deserves a paper in its own right. And you've effectively invented a novel incentivized machine learning technique, and you guys are just moving too fast. You haven't had time.
Yeah, I promised Shib a NeurIPS paper this year, so I'll be damned if I don't get him one.
Great. And people can see us there. Okay, is there any more questions for us, Bond, or was that it's a fairly quiet one today? People seem...
It's been fairly quiet.
People feel satiated. That's good. That's great. So we did promise we were going to do this every 2 weeks, and here we are. We may even be able to do another one of these in less than a week, but likely the next one is in 2 weeks from here. We're going to showcase different subnets. We give people opportunities to talk about their subnet. Shout at us and ask questions and be integrated with Bittensor viscerally in the way that was intended to be. So thanks everyone for coming. Stefan, amazing work, presentation. Thank you so much. Bond as well, and everyone else for their questions across the board. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Guys.